The summons arrived without preamble, a stiff, formal envelope amidst Marcus's usual collection of academic journals and overdue library notices. His life, meticulously ordered around the silent companionship of historical texts, rarely tolerated such disruptions. Marcus, a man whose existence was a testament to the pursuit of objective truth, found little patience for the unpredictable currents of human affairs. He specialized in the forgotten minutiae of past civilizations, a reclusive historian who preferred the company of deceased monarchs and long-vanished empires to the living. The letter, from a provincial solicitor, detailed the unexpected demise of a distant relative he barely remembered. An obscure branch of the family tree whose existence he had only ever acknowledged in a cursory glance at a genealogical chart years ago. The inheritance was substantial. Blackwood Manor. The name itself carried a faint, unsettling echo, a whisper of local legends Marcus had encountered in passing during his research into regional folklore. Tales of misfortune, madness, and a pervasive, lingering malevolence. He dismissed them. Superstition, nothing more. The collective anxieties of isolated communities often manifested in such fantastical narratives, he reasoned, a primitive attempt to explain the inexplicable. His interest was purely academic. An ancient structure, potentially rich with historical records, now his to catalog and perhaps eventually sell. Weeks later, the journey began, a long, winding descent from the structured urban sprawl he inhabited into a landscape increasingly rugged and remote. The tarmac gave way to gravel, then to a track barely wider than his vehicle, hemmed in by ancient skeletal trees. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Marcus, typically impervious to environmental shifts, felt a subtle pressure behind his eyes, a dull ache that resonated with the increasing isolation. The sky, once a pale, indifferent blue, had curdled into a bruised purple, mirroring the brooding landscape. The track finally opened onto a precipitous cliff edge. Below, the sea churned with an unsettling vigor, its gray waves crashing against jagged rocks and disappearing into the black mouths of the coastal caves. A shiver, not entirely from the biting wind, traced its way down Marcus's spine. The manor stood sentinel on the bluff, a silhouette against the tumultuous sky. Blackwood Manor. It was larger than he had anticipated, a sprawling edifice of dark, weathered stone, its gables sharp as predatory claws, its windows like vacant, unblinking eyes. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, choked parts of its facade, obscuring details, suggesting a long and deliberate neglect. No light emanated from within, no smoke curled from its chimneys. It simply was. A monolithic presence that seemed less built than grown from the very rock it occupied. The wind carried a mournful keen, a sound that seemed to emanate not from the sea, but from the very stones of the house. Marcus exited the car, his movements precise, almost clinical, as if he were approaching a specimen under observation. The ground underfoot was coarse gravel, scattered with brittle leaves and fragments of something unidentifiable, like ancient bone shards. A narrow, overgrown path led to a massive oak door, studded with black iron. The wood was deeply scarred, pitted by centuries of exposure, yet it felt impossibly solid, unyielding. He produced a heavy, tarnished brass key from his pocket, given to him by the solicitor. Its weight felt significant, almost symbolic. As he inserted it into the lock, a faint metallic groan echoed from within the manor, a sound that resonated deep within the structure. The tumblers clicked with an unnerving finality. He pushed the door inward. It moved with a slow, grinding resistance, revealing an interior plunged into profound gloom. Marcus stepped over the threshold. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, distant roar of the sea against the cliffs. No creaks, no settling timbers, no rustle of vermin. Just an encompassing, impenetrable stillness that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a deliberate suppression. He was a rational man. He believed in evidence, in verifiable facts. Yet, even his disciplined mind registered the profound, almost tangible weight of the house, a presence that settled over him like a shroud. He felt a distinct impression, not of being alone, but of being observed. The manor, he thought, had been waiting. The manor's interior swallowed Marcus whole, a cavernous maw of polished dark wood and shadowed alcoves. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy panes, illuminating a pervasive, ancient stillness. He surveyed the grand study, its walls lined with empty shelves that seemed to sigh with the absence of their former contents. This space, he decided, would be his operational hub. His boxes, filled with meticulously organized research materials, waited in the hallway like silent sentinels. He began the arduous task of unpacking, his determination a formidable counterpoint to the manor's oppressive silence. Each box yielded a familiar treasure: leather-bound tomes, bundles of brittle academic papers, his own annotated printouts. He arranged them by chronological period, by theme, by author, a systematic approach that grounded him. The rhythmic tearing of tape, the rustle of packing paper, the soft thud of books settling onto shelves. These were the sounds of order being imposed upon chaos, of intellect asserting itself. Hours bled into one another. Marcus lost himself in the scent of aged paper and the satisfying weight of a well-researched volume. He moved from box to box, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. It was like submerging his skin in ice water, sharp and biting, localized entirely to the space between the book and the shelf. He snatched his hand back, a shiver tracing his spine. He frowned, inspecting the wall. No visible cracks, no obvious draft. An old house, he reasoned, susceptible to capricious temperature fluctuations. Perhaps a poorly sealed window on the floor above, channeling a stray current. He resumed unpacking, dismissing the sensation as a trivial anomaly. Later, while cross-referencing notes on a particularly obscure lineage, a faint, almost subvocal murmur reached his ears. He paused, pen hovering over a page, listening intently. Wind, he concluded, sighing through a ventilation shaft or an ill-fitted chimney flue. The manor, after all, was a labyrinth of such archaic engineering. His meticulously arranged system, however, began to show minor, disconcerting discrepancies. He distinctly remembered placing his specialized archival pen, a slender instrument with a fine, indelible point, beside his current working journal. Yet when he reached for it, the pen was gone. He searched, his brow furrowed with mild irritation, only to discover it resting inside a box he had emptied an hour prior, nestled amongst discarded packing paper. He exhaled slowly. Distraction. Overwork. The mental fatigue of moving into a new, unfamiliar space. He chided himself for his own absent-mindedness. A historian's brain, he mused, often too preoccupied with the past to fully register the present. The manor continued its subtle assault on his perceptions. A specific chair in the drawing room, which he had angled towards the empty fireplace, he found later turned to face the window, its back to the hearth. A heavy brass letter opener left on the mantelpiece migrated to a side table. Each instance, small and easily rationalized, accumulated, forming a faint, persistent hum beneath the surface of his conscious thought. He attributed it to the imprecise memory of an exhausted mind, the subtle settling of a vast old structure, the idiosyncrasies of a building that had seen centuries pass. He decided to explore the manor's original library, a room he had thus far avoided due to its sheer scale and overwhelming disarray. Dust lay thick on every surface, lending the air a cloying, earthy sweetness. As he ran a hand along a shelf, seeking a suitable spot for his overflow texts, his fingers brushed against a loose panel behind a row of crumbling encyclopedias. Curiosity, the driving force of his profession, compelled him to investigate. He pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, Nestled amongst desiccated cobwebs lay a small leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a faded, unidentifiable crest. Beside it, a bundle of letters, tied with a brittle, faded ribbon. The paper was parchment thin, the ink a sepia ghost. A thrill of academic discovery surged through him, momentarily eclipsing the lingering unease. These were primary sources, untainted, undiscovered. He carefully carried his finds back to the study, placing them reverently on his desk. The journal, he noted, was dated from the late 18th century. Its script was elegant, florid, yet often marred by frantic crossings out and heavy indentations. He began to read, his clinical detachment initially intact. The entries chronicled the life of a previous owner, a woman, whose early prose was filled with the mundane details of estate management and social calls. I find myself forgetting simple things, names, appointments. The very air thickens, pressing in. My husband dismisses it as melancholia. They speak of what was, what will be. They twist the memories of joy into sharp, ugly things. It follows. It consumes. Marcus paused, his fingers tracing the agitated loops of the script. The woman's struggles were evident, a descent into what he initially categorized as a severe psychological affliction, perhaps exacerbated by isolation and the prevailing medical ignorance of her era. He recognized the pattern. Paranoia, memory degradation, auditory hallucinations. He had seen them on the property maps, a distant, rugged stretch of shoreline. Why would she seek solace there, only to feel the manor's influence still? He continued to read, the subsequent entries growing increasingly fragmented, desperate. My thoughts are no longer my own. They are echoes, strangers in my mind. The house feeds. It takes. Soon there will be nothing left but the shell and the hunger. The final entry was a single stark word, repeated until the page was consumed by ink. Empty, empty, empty. Marcus closed the journal, the soft thud echoing in the quiet room. He rationalized it as the power of the narrative, the tragic descent of a disturbed mind. Marcus closed the journal, the soft thud echoing in the quiet room. His historian's mind, so adept at dissecting the past, felt a prickle of something less academic, something akin to a nascent dread. Yet as he set the leather-bound book aside, the silence of the manor seemed to deepen, pressing in from the heavy drapes and the shadowed corners. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of research and disquiet. He spent hours in the library, surrounded by dusty tomes and brittle manuscripts, attempting to impose order on the chaotic lineage of the manor's former occupants. His initial skepticism, a professional shield against the fanciful, began to fray at the edges. It started subtly. A faint scrape from the floorboards above when he knew the upper levels were empty. The distinct, rhythmic creak of a hinge, though no door was open. He would pause, straining his ears, but the sounds would cease, leaving only the ancient house's profound stillness. He attributed them to the settling of old timber, the wind's peculiar acoustics. Not distinct words, but a breathy, sibilant murmur, like dry leaves skittering across stone, or distant conversations carried on a fickle breeze. They would drift from the periphery of his hearing, often when he was engrossed in a particularly dense passage of text, causing him to lift his head, scanning the empty room. He told himself it was auditory pareidolia, the brain imposing patterns on random noise, a consequence of prolonged solitude. Each time, when he focused, there was nothing. Just the static grandeur of the room, the dust motes dancing in the light. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, dismissed them as optical illusions, the result of too many hours poring over faded script. His sleep offered no reprieve. Nightmares, vivid and unsettling, began to haunt his hours of unconsciousness. He saw hallways stretching into impossible distances, Rooms filled with unidentifiable shifting shapes, and always, the pervasive sense of being watched. He would wake abruptly, the taste of dust in his mouth, the faint tremor of residual fear lingering in his chest. Driven by a growing need for answers, Marcus intensified his research. He meticulously cross-referenced old census records, local newspaper archives, and private correspondence he found tucked away in forgotten desk drawers. The pattern emerged slowly, like a stain spreading across a parchment map. The manor had a history less of ownership and more of consumption. There was Eleanor Vance, a recluse artist in the late 18th century, who, after years of painting increasingly distorted landscapes from her studio window, vanished without a trace. He had become obsessed with the coastal caves nearby, believing they held a secret resonance with the manor, a place he would sketch compulsively, her drawings becoming more abstract, her figures more skeletal. He was never found, presumed lost to the sea. Then came the Caldwell family in the mid-19th century. A prosperous merchant and his wife, they moved in with high hopes. Dr. Alistair Finch. He intended to write a definitive history of the region from the manor's quiet solitude. His published letters, discovered among the manor's papers, detailed a growing paranoia, a conviction that the house itself was a living entity, feeding on his thoughts. Madness, disappearance, suicide. And the common thread was always prolonged isolation within the manor's walls. Each resident, initially drawn by its grandeur or its promise of peace, had slowly unraveled. They hadn't just lived here. They had been absorbed. The air in the library, once merely stale, now felt heavy, almost viscous. He looked around, no longer seeing just ancient books and furniture, but the silent witnesses to a recurring tragedy. It was a predator. And he, Marcus, was its latest inhabitant. He was its next meal. He walked to the window, pulling aside a heavy curtain. The manor loomed around him, vast and silent. Yet now, to his ears, it seemed to pulse with a low, hungry hum. The patterns Marcus had meticulously catalogued, the madness, the disappearances, the suicides, formed a cold, precise mosaic. Each piece, a generation's misfortune, all connected by the manor's formidable presence and the prolonged isolation within its walls. His initial intellectual curiosity, a historian's detached fascination, began to curdle into something colder, something less easily categorized. The archives mentioned several past residents had found solace, or perhaps distraction, in the rugged coastline nearby. He drove the winding, overgrown track until it ended abruptly at a sheer cliff face, then continued on foot down a treacherous, narrow path. The roar of the ocean intensified with each step, a primal sound that offered a stark contrast to the manor's suffocating quiet. He descended into the coastal caves, their gaping mouths carved by eons of relentless waves. Inside, the air was damp and cool, tasting of salt and ancient stone. The vastness of the natural formations, the indifferent power of the sea, should have offered a sense of perspective, a calming insignificance. Instead, Marcus felt a new, disorienting sensation. A fleeting image, not a true vision, but a distortion at the edge of his perception, flickered in the wet reflection of a tidal pool. A silhouette, stooped and burdened, gazing out at the churning gray expanse. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a profound, unbidden wave of despair that was not his own. He shivered, despite the exertion of the climb, and turned back towards the manor, the brief respite shattered. The house, it seemed, had already begun to extend its reach, or perhaps its tendrils were now rooted so deeply within him that escape was an illusion. Back within the manor's stone embrace, the sense of being watched intensified. It was not a malevolent gaze in the conventional sense, but something more invasive, a presence that probed, assessed, and catalogued. The old house groaned and sighed around him, but these were not merely the sounds of shifting timbers. He heard faint conversations, the murmur of voices echoing from empty rooms, just beyond the threshold of audibility. A child's distant, melancholic hum drifted from the upper landing one afternoon, a melody that resonated with an unsettling familiarity, though he had never heard it before. Marcus blinked, and the image solidified back into its original, impassive state. His breath caught in his throat. He ran a hand over the canvas, feeling only the dry, uneven surface. He attributed it to fatigue, a trick of the dim lamplight, but the tremor in his fingers betrayed his conviction. The visions grew more insistent, less fleeting. He found himself standing in the main hall, drawn by an invisible current. The scent of wood smoke, heavy and cloying, filled his lungs. For a moment, the grand staircase was not empty but populated. Her hand, pale and slender, gripped the banister with white-knuckled intensity. Then, as suddenly as it began, the tableau dissolved. The wood smoke dissipated. The hall was empty, silent, save for the relentless creaks of the old structure. Marcus pressed his palms against his eyes, the image seared behind his lids. He was not merely witnessing these events. He was present in them, absorbing the residual emotions like a sponge. The house was not merely occupied by spirits. It was replaying its past, a vast, complex mechanism of memory. The manor itself was the repository, the projector, and he, Marcus, was becoming the unwilling audience. Not wind. Scent of lavender and decay, third floor west corridor. No source. Brief, intense flash of despair, kitchen, accompanied by sound of shattering ceramic. His skepticism, his carefully constructed intellectual fortress, began to show fissures, but the sheer volume and visceral intensity of the experiences overwhelmed his logic. The house was not a passive observer. It was an active participant. He felt his own thoughts becoming less distinct, his own identity blurring at the edges. He was no longer just Marcus, the historian. He was becoming a vessel, a conduit for the manor's unending, agonizing past. The walls were not just replaying memories. They were implanting them, slowly, meticulously, into his own mind. He was being absorbed. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air in the silent, expectant embrace of the house. He no longer felt like an academic dissecting a subject. He felt like a participant, drawn into the very fabric of the history he uncovered. The outside world, once a clear boundary, had blurred. Days bled into one another, marked less by the sun's arc and more by the shifting quality of light through the manor's grimy panes, or the slow creep of shadows across the oak-paneled walls. The thought of the town, its small talk and familiar faces, now seemed distant, almost irritatingly trivial. His research, the true history of this place, felt paramount, a sacred trust. One afternoon, a specific entry in an old parish register, a mention of a local family's sudden, unexplained relocation after a visit to the coastal caves, sparked a flicker of his old investigative drive. He retrieved his jacket, feeling the familiar weight of the worn tweed, and headed towards the front door. A profound reluctance, heavy and physical, settled in his chest. It was not fatigue, but an inertia that felt external, a subtle resistance in the very air around him. The manor seemed to sigh, a low, almost imperceptible groan from its ancient timbers, as if displeased by his impending departure. The idea of the wind-whipped cliffs, the salty spray, the rough texture of ancient rock, suddenly seemed unappealing, too stark, too exposed. The warmth of the library, the comforting must of old paper and dust, pulled his back. He withdrew his hand, the planned excursion evaporating like mist. The urgency to explore the cave simply dissolved, replaced by a quiet, insistent urge to return to his ledgers. He had not contacted his solicitor in over a week. A brief, unsettling thought about the solicitor's last call, a concerned query about his welfare crossed his mind. He picked up the heavy, old-fashioned telephone receiver in the study. No dial tone. He tried the mobile phone he kept charged, though rarely used. The screen glowed, indicating full battery, but the signal icon remained stubbornly empty. He walked to the window, then to the attic, then even out to the overgrown garden, holding the device aloft. Nothing. He tried to rationalize it. A local mast issue, perhaps. The isolation was no longer a choice. It was a state of being imposed upon him. His appearance had suffered. Shaving had become an infrequent ritual. Meals were forgotten or improvised from whatever stale provisions remained in the pantry. He consumed strong coffee and biscuits, fueling his relentless work, his mind a perpetual engine of historical deduction. His clothes, once pressed and neat, now bore the subtle stains of ink and the fine layer of dust that seemed to settle everywhere, an intrinsic part of the manor's atmosphere. He barely noticed. It was a vast, encompassing awareness that resonated with his own solitude. They felt like responses, a dialogue without words. He started to interpret this not as malevolence, but as a deep, peculiar intimacy. The house knew him. It had chosen him. It watched over him, even as it subtly, almost imperceptibly drew something vital from him. His own energy, his will, seemed to seep into the ancient stones, invigorating the house while leaving him with a peculiar, drained contentment. He was no longer merely chronicling the manor's victims. He was becoming part of its living, breathing history. A strange, ominous comfort settled within him, a quiet acceptance of his diminishing connection to the world beyond these walls. He was home. The entry read, 1798, The Mariner's Descent. Madness, then the sea. But the handwriting wasn't his. It was a delicate, looping script, unfamiliar yet hauntingly intimate. He stared at his own hand, then back at the page. Had he written this? He couldn't remember. The manor was no longer merely isolated. It was becoming a labyrinth. He had walked through the library, intending to enter the adjoining study, only to find himself in the sprawling dining hall. A door he swore led to the north wing now opened onto a small, unused pantry, its shelves thick with dust and a faint, sweet smell of decay. He'd test the solidity of the walls, running his palm over the cold stone, convincing himself they were fixed, permanent. Yet moments later, a familiar tapestry would hang in an unfamiliar alcove, or a window he remembered facing west now offered a view to the east. The disorientation was subtle at first, a trick of the light, a lapse in memory. Now it was an undeniable, malicious rearrangement. He tried to map the house, drawing intricate diagrams, but the lines shifted beneath his pen, the rooms refusing to conform. He'd mark a hallway, only for it to stretch or contract when he next traversed it, a physical manifestation of his fraying grasp on reality. He heard the muffled clang of a distant bell, the rush of water, the creak of timbers under unseen strain. Not merely recognition, but a deep, unsettling resonance. Her suffering seemed to echo within him. He remembered the gardener's words, the specific inflection, the way the light had caught the old man's weathered face. But Marcus had never met the gardener. Yet the memories were vivid, potent, as if they were his own. He caught his reflection in a polished mirror in the master bedroom. For a fleeting instant, his face seemed older, etched with a weariness that wasn't solely his. His eyes, usually sharp and analytical, held a haunted, distant quality. He stared, unblinking, at the stranger staring back. "You're tired," he murmured, but the voice that responded in his mind was not his own. It was deeper, laced with a profound sorrow. "So very tired, Eleanor." Eleanor. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples. He was Marcus. He was a historian. He had come here to research, but the memories of Eleanor, her quiet desperation, her walks through these very halls, her yearning for the coastal caves as a sanctuary or an end, were more immediate, more real than his own recent past. He sought a specific window, one he recalled Eleanor using to gaze out at the distant gray line of the sea. The house seemed to resist, doors slamming shut just as he reached them, hallways twisting into dead ends. He would turn a corner, expecting the familiar, only to be met by a wall of ancient damp stone or a staircase leading nowhere but into the ceiling. The house was not merely shifting, it was actively manipulating him, guiding him, or perhaps trapping him. It was a vast, sentient mind, and he was merely a thought within it, a memory it was slowly absorbing. The boundaries between his consciousness and the collective anguish of the manor's past inhabitants were dissolving. The house had swallowed the path, just as it was swallowing him. Eleanor. The name, a raw nerve, pulsed behind Marcus's eyes. He stood in the library, the scent of aged paper and dry dust clinging to the air, his fingers still tracing the worn spine of the volume he'd been holding. He was Marcus. He was a historian. He had come here to research. Yet the conviction of his own identity wavered, a fragile flag in a rising gale. He pushed the thought aside, a futile attempt to regain equilibrium. This house, it was doing something to him, not merely unsettling, but actively, subtly, altering his perceptions. He needed to understand Eleanor. If her memories were so readily accessible, perhaps others were too. Perhaps the house itself was a repository, a dark archive. Driven by a cold, clinical curiosity that warred with a rising dread, Marcus began to systematically search the manor's oldest sections. He bypassed the main studies and drawing rooms, heading instead for the rarely accessed attics and the forgotten subterranean passages. The air grew heavier, cooler, as he descended stone steps into what felt like the manor's very foundations. Here, the silence was not merely an absence of sound, but a palpable pressure against his eardrums. A faint, earthy smell like damp soil and something metallic permeated the space. In a small, windowless chamber beneath the kitchen, a space he'd previously overlooked, Marcus found a collection of old journals, their leather bindings cracked and brittle. They were Eleanor's. Her name, scrawled in an elegant looping hand on the first page of the uppermost volume, confirmed it. Eleanor's early entries detailed a life of quiet domesticity, observations of the changing seasons, the challenges of managing a large estate. But as the pages turned, a subtle shift occurred. Her handwriting grew more erratic, her observations increasingly fragmented. She described moments of profound disorientation, forgetting conversations she'd just had, finding objects in places she swore she hadn't left them. Then a recurring theme emerged: the coastal caves. Eleanor described them not as a place of refuge, but of a desperate final hope. She believed something within the caves might offer protection, or perhaps an escape from the house's insidious influence. Her entries grew more feverish, speaking of a transfer, a sustenance, and a horrifying realization that the manor was not merely old, but alive. It fed. As he read Eleanor's words, he experienced his own fleeting moments of confusion. He'd just read a sentence, then found himself rereading it, convinced he'd missed something, yet the words were the same. A dull ache began to throb behind his eyes, a phantom fatigue seeping into his bones. He felt lighter somehow, less substantial, as if parts of him were being gently, imperceptibly siphoned away. He looked around the cramped chamber. The air here felt charged, almost viscous. The house was not just influencing him, it was actively taking. Eleanor's final entries were barely legible, a frantic scrawl. They were echoes, husks, the previous meals. She described a profound emptiness, a sense of self-dissolving, replaced by the house's own ancient, malevolent consciousness. The coastal caves were her last desperate gamble. She believed the house, in its immense age, had a vulnerability, a point of satiety, and perhaps a source of its perverse energy that lay beyond its walls, connected to the sea. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but with a horrifying clarity that bypassed all rational filters. The house was a predator. Not a ghost, not a curse, but a vast organic entity rooted to the land, its tendrils reaching through the very fabric of time and memory. It consumed, it absorbed, it grew stronger with each inhabitant, each mind, each life force it devoured. And he, Marcus, was its current meal. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless and trembling. He was not merely researching a haunted manor. He was trapped within a living maw, his memories, his sanity, his very essence being slowly, methodically ingested. He was being fed upon. And the house, he now understood, was growing stronger. The name Eleanor had not merely echoed. It had vibrated within Marcus, a discordant string plucked in the otherwise silent, suffocating expanse of the manor. The house, he realized with chilling clarity, had intended for the memory to be another meal, another sliver of his past to digest and dissolve. Instead, it had ignited something sharp, something resistant. A cold, analytical fury began to simmer beneath the surface of his terror. He was Marcus, a historian, a man whose life had been dedicated to uncovering truths, even the most uncomfortable ones. The house had blurred his reality, distorted his perceptions, but this specific, aching memory of Eleanor had cut through the fog like a cleaver. He would not surrender. He felt the house's subtle pushback immediately. A faint, cloying scent, like damp earth and ancient iron, intensified, pressing against his senses. The air in the library, already heavy with the aroma of decaying paper, seemed to grow thicker, each breath a conscious effort. He ignored it, his gaze sweeping across the shelves, no longer admiring the antique bindings, but searching for an anomaly, a dislodged volume, a hidden catch. His thoughts raced, a frantic torrent. The house fed on memory, on sanity. Its weakness, then, must be rooted in its origins, in the mechanism that allowed it to exist. He needed facts, however arcane. He moved from the library to his study, the floorboards groaning underfoot as if in protest. His desk, usually an ordered landscape of notes and historical texts, appeared subtly altered. A slight shift in the stack of papers, a pen lying where it shouldn't. He fought the urge to dismiss it as his own failing memory. The house was trying to disorient him. He began systematically. He pulled out drawers, emptying them of their contents, sifting through correspondence and research. Nothing. He ran his hands along the wainscoting, checking for loose panels. His fingers grazed a section of the wall behind a large, antique map cabinet, a cabinet he had never truly examined beyond its decorative value. The wood felt different, slightly rougher, less polished. He pressed, pushed, pulled. A faint click, almost imperceptible over the muted thrumming in his own ears, rewarded him. A narrow seam appeared, almost invisible, outlining a small, recessed compartment. Inside, nestled on a velvet lining that had long since lost its pile, sat a single leather-bound ledger. It was smaller than most of the books in the library, its cover devoid of title or author, the leather cracked and dry like ancient skin. Its edges were frayed, and the faint scent of mildew clung to it. This was not a book from the main collection. This was hidden. Marcus's hands trembled as he opened it. The pages, brittle and yellowed, were filled with a cramped, looping script, faded but legible. It was a journal, not of history, but of desperation. The entries were dated, spanning a period in the late 17th century, written by a previous owner, a woman named Isabel. The initial entries were mundane, observations on the weather, household matters. Then, a shift. Isabel understood. He had seen it too. He skipped ahead, his eyes scanning for clues, for anything that hinted at resistance. He found it. a series of frantic, almost illegible entries describing a growing awareness, a fight for sanity. It desires all. He laid its roots not in stone, but in sacrifice. He continued reading, his heart accelerating with each word. Isabel's final, almost incoherent entry spoke of a counter-ritual, a way to sever the binding, to starve the entity. It required a specific component, a fragment of that very mineral, to be returned to its place of origin at a precise astrological alignment. The ledger contained a crude, hand-drawn map. It was not of the manor, but of the surrounding coastline, marked with faded ink. A prominent X was scrawled over a section depicting jagged cliffs and churning water. The coastal caves, the very place local folklore spoke of as cursed, forbidden. It was not just superstition. It was a warning. The house responded to his discovery. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure that pushed against his chest. Marcus clutched the journal, his knuckles white. The house was fighting back, aware of his newfound knowledge, aware of the threat he now posed. It wanted to consume this information, to dissolve his resolve. But the memory of Eleanor, and now Isabel's desperate legacy, fueled him. He had a path, however perilous. He had a glimmer of resistance. The coastal caves. That was where he had to go. The air, dense and cold, pressed against Marcus. The revelation of the coastal caves had been a catalyst. The house had reacted, a living organism recoiling from a perceived threat. If the caves were indeed the key, then the house's resistance confirmed their significance. His resolve, though brittle, hardened. He turned from the study desk, the parchment with its cryptic notes still clutched in his hand. The door, which he had left ajar, was now shut, a silent barrier of aged oak. He approached it, his hand reaching for the brass knob. Before his fingers made contact, a low groan emanated from the wood, and the door shuddered violently, then slammed inward with a force that rattled the very foundations of the room. A gust of frigid air, smelling of damp earth and decay, swept past him. Marcus stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. This was not the settling of an old structure. This was deliberate. The house was fighting back. He forced himself to move, navigating the suddenly treacherous corridor. The floorboards, usually creaking predictably, now shifted beneath his weight as if deliberately attempting to unbalance him. A faint, cloying scent, like withered roses and something metallic, began to permeate the air. As he neared the grand staircase, the banister, usually smooth beneath his palm, felt rough and splintered, as if centuries of grasping hands had worn it raw. He began his descent. Each step was an act of defiance. The staircase groaned under him, the wood complaining, flexing, threatening to give way. He gripped the banister tighter, his knuckles white. It was not a solid form, but a shimmering distortion, like heat haze rising from asphalt. Yet it held a distinct, gaunt silhouette. It stretched, its elongated arm reaching towards him, not with an explicit gesture of menace, but with an unsettling, grasping motion. He felt his own memories begin to unravel, fragments of his childhood, faces of people he had known, blurring at the edges. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, then opened them, forcing himself to push through the wave of borrowed anguish. He reached the ground floor, his legs trembling. The path to the main exit and then to the coastline was through a long gallery. As he entered, the portraits lining the walls, usually passive observers, seemed to shift their gazes. Their eyes, painted with meticulous detail, followed him. Then, the true assault began. The gallery's far end, leading towards the seaward entrance, became obscured. A thick, swirling fog, impossibly appearing indoors, began to coalesce, smelling sharply of brine and something acrid. Within the mist, figures began to materialize, not the vague distortions from before, but more distinct, though still ephemeral. They were human-shaped, some appearing as hunched, ancient women, others as desperate skeletal men. One figure, closer than the others, a woman in tattered, archaic clothing, raised a translucent hand. He flinched, but there was no physical mark, only the phantom pain and an accompanying flash of a memory that was not his. A child crying, a fire blazing in the distance. The vision was so vivid, so real, that for a horrifying moment, he questioned his own identity, his own past. He shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the intrusive impression. This was the house's ultimate weapon, the erosion of self, the blurring of lines between his reality and its accumulated horrors. It sought to break his will, to absorb him entirely into its fabric of suffering. But the terrible hope still flickered. The coastal caves, they were the only way. He pressed forward, one foot in front of the other, through the shifting gallery, the spectral figures pressing closer, their silent accusations and despair washing over him. The air grew impossibly heavy, pushing against him like a solid wall. The house was a living, breathing entity, and it was fighting for its life, or perhaps for his. Every step towards the exit was a battle against its malevolent will, a testament to his fading sanity. The path to the coastal caves was a gauntlet, and he was already bleeding. He understood its shift. The knowledge of the caves, its hidden vulnerability, was a poison. The house wanted him broken, disoriented, another forgotten memory to consume. The faint metallic tang of dust and decay that had become constant in the air now carried a sharper, almost organic note, like damp earth disturbed after centuries. His descent began in the kitchen pantry, behind a sagging shelf of empty jars. The floor here had always felt unstable. Now, a section of ancient flagstones, previously immovable, shifted under his focused pressure. This was it, the house's core. The passage was narrow, unlit, descending sharply. Marcus fumbled for the heavy-duty lamp he had prepared. Its beam cut through the absolute black, revealing walls of rough-hewn stone slick with moisture. It was a pulse, slow and immense. Then the passage opened. Marcus stepped into a vast, cavernous space, far larger than he could have imagined. The lamp beam struggled to illuminate its full extent. In the center of the chamber, a massive, irregular column of this same black crystalline material rose from the floor, reaching into the unseen ceiling. This was the house's heart, its root. As his eyes adjusted, he saw that the column was not solid. It was composed of countless, tightly interwoven tendrils, each one crystalline, yet appearing organic, like petrified roots. The house was not merely built over something, it was grown from it. This vast subterranean network was its true form, its consciousness. The true reveal solidified in his mind. The structure was a living geologic entity. The tendrils, he understood now, were not just roots for structural integrity. They were conduits. They siphoned something from the earth, from the rock, from the very deep, and processed it. The house above, with its rooms and corridors, was merely the visible, cultivated portion of this colossal, hidden organism. And the coastal caves. He knew his plan was risky, bordering on suicidal. He had brought the tools, specialized drills, charges. His intent was to sever these primary conduits, to cut off the flow, to starve the entity. He moved toward the central column, each step a deliberate act of defiance. The air around the column was thick, almost viscous, laden with the scent of damp earth, minerals, and something else. A faint, sickly sweetness that made his stomach clench. As he approached, the low thrumming intensified, vibrating through the rock, through his feet, up his legs, into his chest. Then the house lashed out, not with physical force, but with a torrent of sensory assault. He staggered, gripping the drill, its cold metal a grounding presence. He fought the urge to recoil, to flee. The house sought to overwhelm him, to make him surrender his will, his identity, to become another forgotten echo within its vast, hungry mind. The hum became a low growl. The air around him shimmered, distorting his vision. He pushed the drill forward, the motor whining, ready to plunge into the house's living crystalline flesh. His mind screamed in protest, urged him to stop, to turn back, but his hands, steady and resolute, pushed harder. This was the threshold. This was the fight for his very existence. Marcus felt a tremor in the floorboards, a subtle vibration that seemed to emanate from the very foundations. It was a low thrum, a resentful pulse. The house was not merely reacting, it was thinking. It was consolidating its defenses, preparing for a more direct engagement. The house had recoiled, not from him, but from the concept, the location of the coastal caves. This implied a vulnerability, a blind spot, or perhaps a tether. If the house fed on memories, perhaps the caves represented a primal, forgotten memory too potent or too ancient for it to fully assimilate, a source of its origin or its eventual undoing. The house was aware of his deduction. He could feel its attention, 1,000 unseen eyes watching, calculating. It was the scent of the sea, the coastal caves. The house was trying to obscure it, to deny its presence. But the scent persisted, a subtle defiance. He had to find the source of the house's resistance, the point of its greatest vulnerability, and strike. He began to move, not towards the main entrance, nor towards any of the upper floors, but down. He descended the servants' stairs, a narrow, winding passage that smelled of mildew and stale air. Each step was deliberate, his hand tracing the rough stone wall. They were memories, unmoored and desperate, pressing against his consciousness. The air here was thick with the scent of wet stone and a faint metallic tang. He could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance, a relentless, maddening rhythm. This was not merely a cellar. It felt like the house's root system, its deep, primal core. The very stones here seemed to pulse with a slow, heavy beat, a subterranean heart. His gaze swept over the walls, searching. He needed to find a direct manifestation, a physical representation of the house's link to the coastal caves. The house was fighting him, not with overt violence, but with a psychological onslaught. Then he saw it. It was not merely damp. It wept. A thin, viscous moisture coated the ancient stones, glistening like oil in the dim light. And from behind it, he heard it. The distinct, rhythmic sound of waves crashing against rock, muffled but unmistakable. The coastal caves. The house had attempted to seal them off, to absorb their essence, but a fragment remained, a raw, exposed nerve. Marcus approached the weeping wall. The air here was almost suffocating, thick with a profound sorrow and an ancient, insatiable hunger. It felt strangely soft, yielding like aged skin. He closed his eyes, focusing his will, pushing against the house's resistance. He was not trying to destroy the house. He was trying to reintroduce the wildness it had tried to consume, to force it to confront the very force it had sought to suppress. A low groan emanated from the stones, a sound that was less structural and more visceral, like the cry of a wounded animal. The air around him turned frigid, then searing hot, then frigid again. He felt himself being pulled, not physically but spiritually, drawn into the swirling vortex of forgotten lives. He opened his eyes, staring at the weeping wall. He pressed harder, pouring his own life force, his own furious will into the ancient stone. He was not just touching the house. He was reaching into its wound, into its very essence. If he was to be consumed, he would go down fighting, a shard of unyielding reality lodged in its throat. The wall began to crack, not with a sharp snap, but with a slow, agonizing groan, like bone grinding against bone. The moisture intensified, turning to a black ichor that seeped from the fissures. The sound of the waves grew louder, clearer, as if the very sea was now pressing against the other side of the stone. The house screamed, a silent, internal shriek that vibrated through Marcus's bones, threatening to shatter him. He resisted, his muscles rigid, his mind a steel trap. He would not yield. He focused on the ocean, on the relentless, indifferent power of the coastal caves. He was a conduit, a weapon. Then, with a shudder that ripped through the entire manor, the weeping wall exploded inwards, not with debris, but with a surge of cold, dark water that smelled of brine and deep earth. It was not a flood, but a concentrated, violent jet, a geyser of primal ocean that struck the far wall of the cellar with devastating force. The sound of the waves, once distant, was now deafening, echoing through the cavernous space. Marcus stumbled back, drenched, gasping. The black ichor had splattered him, clinging to his skin like tar. The phantom figures vanished. The house was silent. Utterly, terribly silent. He stood there, dripping, shivering, staring at the raw, gaping hole in the cellar wall, from which the distinct, powerful roar of the coastal caves now poured. The house was wounded, mortally perhaps. He had done it. He had struck a blow. But as he looked down at his hands, still coated in the black ichor, he noticed a subtle change. His skin, where the viscous liquid had touched it, seemed to possess a faint, translucent sheen. And deep within him, he felt a new resonance, a faint, distant echo of the house's silence, a lingering chill that was not merely from the cold water, but from something deeper, something that had perhaps, in its final, desperate throes, managed to leave a piece of itself within him. He was free, perhaps, but the question remained. What exactly had he brought back with him from the house's dying embrace?